My name is Jens Hoffmann. I'm Deputy Director of the Jewish Museum in New York. And this is Valeska Soares, who we are working with at the moment at the Jewish Museum for a new installation, which you see here on the screen. It's part of our ongoing series where we commission artists to make artworks for the lobby at the Jewish Museum. The series is titled Using Floor, Walls, and Ceiling. And it's a series that goes back to a project that curator Susan Goodman did at the Jewish Museum in the 1970s, where she started to invite many artists from that era to make commissions at the museum. We sort of like relaunched that whole series. And Valeska is the fourth one in the series. This piece that you see here on the screen is called Time Has No Shadow. And I thought maybe we could begin talking about your work based on this particular installation. Mm-hmm. I think that the installation brings together a lot of different concerns that you have developed over a longer period of time, and perhaps we sort of can think about those. And one of the things that happens here, if you can't really see it, is that there is a carpet. On the carpet, you have text that is silk-screened on it, and each text refers to a sentence that deals with time. And above the text, which is... in
form of a spiral?
Please. Give us an example of one of the...
Well, basically the work is composed of two elements. 24 pocket watches, antique pocket watches that have been altered. And the hour hand has been removed. So you only have the seconds and the minutes. And the rug, which has these silkscreen tags. And the rug, it's a reference between many other things to the original house, the mansion, that, you know, this was the lobby of the mansion, and they had a wall-to-wall rug. And so it gives it a little bit of domesticity, but you know, I also like very much the idea of the rug of a sort of like grounding and this mobile home, or, you know, a place that you ground yourself and you can take it with you, which is, you know, it's been from the beginning of time what like nomad people used, and I guess it's still to this day a rug is a definition of space, of territory. And the idea of the watches, it's like, it's a way to go back to a collective memory of consciousness, and also to, you know, to refer to this kind of, the most special, time is one of the most valuable currencies that we have, because we have a life that ends, but also as an artist, you need time to think and to do the work. Without time, I mean, if you have, you know, you can't do what I do, I guess. So to me, it's a very valuable currency. And removing the hands of the watches, it takes time to a subjective place.
But they're all in different types.
Yes, I mean, the watches are supposed to be winded by the public. So each one will measure this time that it's subjective. I mean, because you don't really know what's going on. It's more about ownership.
You don't really know what time it is. You only see the minutes passing.
Yes, and the seconds, and sometimes you don't even see because you leave, right?
Well, so many don't have a second, like an arm for the second.
They do. All of them have seconds and minutes. So, but also, you know, like you leave your time behind, because you leave and that watch keeps ticking and you started it. So, in a way, it leaves a trace.
Many people have asked me, why did Valeska do this particular piece for the Jewish Museum?
Why did I do it for the Jewish Museum? Well, my work, it relates to context. So I mean, this piece, although it can work in other, other contexts, at the Jewish Museum assumes a very particular context. I mean, there is the watches, several watches, have reference to a period of time in history that was, between the First and the Second World War. That there was everybody knows about the Holocaust, those pictures, of how the shoes and clothes and jewelry, how the left behind possessions of people. So that, so these watches in the Jewish Museum, they assume this kind of, they get this human quality and relate to the Shoah, no? I mean, in another place, it's going to relate to something else. Also, the rug relates to the museum, as I said before, because of the place, but also it indicates, it talks about displacement and grounding, which is something that, Jewish people throughout times have been subjected to, nomadism, no? And also, I found out doing the work that there is a dichotomy, because these rugs are Persian, so the religion, it's Muslim, which is like the opposite. I mean, not the opposite, but, they're always in conflict, right? Major conflicts, even today, they're between these two because of that. And in a lot of homes, Freud cabinet had several Persian rugs. So it's interesting, the mixture of culture. But then I found out that because of nomadism, Jewish craftspeople, travel all over those countries, and probably they were part of the making of these rugs. This rug was very funny because after I got it, it has a whole history related to it. The owner of the store that sold them was killed, and it's all documented at the New York Times. So it's another layer. So all these objects have different layers of stories that accumulate that I find interesting.
Tell me a little bit more about the title, Time Has No Shadow. I feel like that the title in itself is interesting in regards to two other exhibitions that you've made in New York, where one is about light, which was the one with all the light bulbs hanging on the ceiling. And of course, time relates to the dust covers. This was an exhibition at 11 Rivington, actually two different exhibitions.
Okay. I'm very interested in dualities, but not on either side of them, but in the passage, that moment that you change from one thing to the other. I think that is a crucial moment in life on everything. So that's why these elements always appear against each other, but not against each other. There's always something that, talks about, I don't know, imaginary or ideal place that maybe we never get there, but that's why it's interesting, like searching for this.
Well, I noticed that it's interesting because this piece also reminded me of the light bulb piece. What's the name of that? The subtle light?
That's called Vagalume. It's Vagalume. It's firefly. If you translate literally to English, it's firefly.
Firefly.
But it's also a vague light.
Yeah, subtle light.
It's a subtle light. Or a light that wanders.
Yeah. And just for all of you who don't know this installation, it was a large amount of light bulbs hanging on the ceiling with cords hanging down, and the audience could go in and pull them, and the lights would go on and off, so the audience sort of control the light situation in the gallery. It was a relatively small gallery space, maybe like the stage here.
It's small, but one of the things that you were one of the few people that realized that piece had to do with the context that was exhibited as well, that gave it a different layer.
Yeah.
Because I really, really wanted to show it at the Lower East Side, close to the Bowery, close to the stores that have all the light fixtures. and in a way deal with that idea, but in a different way, you know. And it was interesting because at the Lower Side, it became a little bit claustrophobic.
Yeah, it was very dense.
It was very dense, and it made you a little nervous. And so that was an interesting thing that didn't happen before when I did it somewhere else. So I think that's what it's interesting for me in my process. It's like learning all the time things about the work that it's not that stable. The meaning, it's not stable. It changes with context. I also like going back to the Jewish Museum, this idea of using the gallery space as the studio, because I can't do these pieces at home, so they only exist at the place that they are. And you know that, the work sometimes is never finished. It's just, it keeps changing, like we're doing with the Jewish Museum, that the installation is on its second version of the installation. I have a third one for you. I want to change it again.
Yeah, so what Valeska is referring to is that we installed the work and the watches were hanging from the ceiling, and we had to adjust the height of the ceiling for safety reasons. People were running into them, they were too low. And I think it took us 2 or 3 versions till we figured out what was the ideal height for the piece to actually work. So it was sort of like a work in progress situation where it wasn't even really finished when we opened it.
Yeah, well,
I don't know if that's typical for your work. I don't think so, no? Normally, like...
Well, sometimes, I think the work, perhaps in the exhibition itself it doesn't change, but it changes depending on the context. And I like this idea that you can learn and you can keep changing. That's what I was telling you, that I have another idea for another hanging.
Well, do you want to talk about that?
Yes.
I don't know when I will see you again, so you should take advantage of that opportunity here.
Yeah, sure. Why not? So, because I was thinking that, the museum, the piece is in a space that it's not exactly an exhibition space, so it's subject to a lot of different, how do you say this?
Well, there's a lot of movement.
Desires and,
yeah, people go into the shop, they buy tickets, they pick up leaflets, they get information, they use the bathrooms.
Yeah, so anyways, there is a lot of concerns regarding the chains. I was just thinking, how can we show like Felix Gonzalez Torres, the curtains without getting sued?
Yeah, I don't know. We
Because
have never
that's
shown
becoming
it.
a problem, Like, if you can, people can get entangled on that too. So anyways, so my new idea for the hanging, it's to make sort of like a column, have 24 holes in a circle, close to each other.
In a circle.
In a circle, and then have them hanging, so it becomes like a column. It's more physical, and that way it becomes a little bit more present, so perhaps people will be able to see it, and they wouldn't bang on them because they're physically, it becomes almost like a sculpture, and then it can connect to the rug again. Because that's another thing. The text that it's in the rug, we knew there was going to disappear. So that's part of the work as well, the disappearance of the written word, the reference to time. So right now, I'm told that there's very little left, right?
Yeah.
So this piece, for me, it has become very interesting in that sense, very playful, that I can go back and put the text in another place, or do re-hangings.
Yeah.
And, you've been quite open about it, which, taking this, putting time into the work as well, Time is just not what it references, but it's part of the process, it's changing it, It exists in time as well.
Changes over time.
Well, it exists in time, right?
It disappears, the text disappears. What are the sentences that are actually on silkscreened on the carpet? We haven't
Well,
spoke
there's
about that.
several. I mean, I don't know all of them by heart, but any moment, no. Give me yesterday. Meanwhile, I want it now.
And where do they come from?
Well, they come from another piece. So it's one piece takes you to another one. So it comes from any moment now, which is this sort of like subjective calendar, infinite library about time. And there's 365 dust jackets from books that refer to time. So I'm sort of like counting time in my way throughout the year. And I went through the 365 titles and did an edit for the Jewish Museum where I took phrases that I thought could exist, you know, isolated from each other, but also could work with each other. And they were sort of like statements, you know. They were not like referencing to a story, but more like I want it now, or the moment after. Things that really, you know, you can take with you, or, it, you know, it's something, I don't know, it's more immediate.
Yeah.
In a way. It can be talking about the past, but it's something that it's an ongoing movement.
But have you always been interested in literature, or for a very long time worked with books, and you removed books completely and just had the covers of the books, and I think there's some pieces here also in the fair of yours like that. Tell me a little bit about your interest in literature, in text, in language.
Well, I've been fascinated with literature since I was a child, you know. I remember my mother giving me these books about, I mean, it was like an archaeological romance about the discovery of the Tutankhamun. And after that, I just got so fascinated. I mean, I grew up in a time that we didn't have that much television and stuff, so books were where you put your imagination on, you know. And books and music. So that to me was always an inspiration, like a place that I could find ideas, or I find that people wrote things that I could relate so much to, that they were talking to me. So I don't know. And then I consider, you know, my work is sort of writing as well, in the sense that it's like I'm creating my own personal, each piece is sort of like a word.
Or a letter.
Or a letter, and then the way I put it together, either in a show or in a display, it becomes a phrase or a paragraph.
Yeah.
And it communicates, like, I would like it, you know, a poetic statement.
Tell me a little bit more about this practice of yours of either removing an element of a particular object or altering it in another way, like with the pocket watches, you remove one of the arms, or in the books, you remove the pages of the book. So like the main function of the object that you're working with is sort of disabled, and that through that process, it sort of enables something else.
Well, a lot of my recent work has dealt with the collection of objects, and I know that's a strategy that's being used by a lot of artists, but I don't want them to be only collections, just a group of things that are similar, like sort of like a fetish kind of thing. I want to use these collections, you know, and give them a twist. So besides existing as a memory of something that has gone, it also, you know, gives them a new meaning. Yeah. So it goes a little further than just being, an anthropological display or archaeological display. It becomes, they get animated again by this other layer. that, you know.
What I like, you said something that I liked before, where you said that like one work follows the other, and that you often sort of carry over elements from previous works or things that are sort of like connected. And I remember that in your last show at 11 Rivington, you were using this idea already with the pocket watches, but you also had these little step ladders involved that you use in libraries, that you use spiral staircases. So it's sort of like interesting universe of objects that I think sort of, I don't know, where would you sort of locate them? Where do they come from? Because I feel like the rugs, also the footstools that you presented, they all sort of like come from a sort of particular universe.
Yes, I can't say exactly where they originate, but they just, you know, I live with things around me all the time. So certain images starts to become more present. For instance, like the spiral shape. I started a long time ago doing labyrinths, which in a way, you know, it refers to this kind of like movement. And then, I don't know, then the step ladders appeared because they relate to libraries, but they also, you know, it relates to this idea of spiraling out of control. And then it appears again on the watches, but it makes sense, you know. There's part of it that you know, it's a little bit about faith as well, because I just have to follow these images and see where they take me. You know, sometimes I don't know exactly where I'm going, but I know I need to go. So, and, you know, you had like this I haven't even thought about the spiral thing, only after you said it, because you found the relationship, and you said like interesting things about the spiraling piece that you know, that I thought people didn't get it before, and you totally saw them. So it's also, the work is also a dialogue, you know, things start happening because the conversation you have with other people as well. The way they see the work, it reflects on the way you see it too. So, you know.
Do you think there's something typical Brazilian about your work? Because I had someone come to the museum and I showed them the installation, and they asked me, where's Valeska from? And I said, oh, she's from Brazil. And then the person said, oh, that makes a lot of sense.
Well, she should tell me what sense does it make, because I have no idea. I don't know. What is it to be Brazilian? I mean, there's so many Brazils. So I don't think there is a face to it. And at this point, I have lived in New York as long as I have lived in Brazil. So half of my life has been here or there. I can't say that anything. How do you say like this is American art, or this is English art, or this is Brazilian art? I think it's like nonsensical, you know. It's about the work.
But I mean, is there any influence, like historical precedents that have lead you to think about art in a particular way that this is also an expression of?
Well, I've been trained as an architect, so developing concepts, it's part of my training, you know. And from architecture school, as we talked before, I was very interested in this proposition of poetic architecture that was not functional. It was about creating, you know, imaginary places. A lot of people were conceptualizing about it, and a lot of people were thinking about the idea of follies, which are almost like a stage where you let your imagination perform. They have no function whatsoever besides, you know, being the stage of personal narratives and desires. So.
You mentioned something a couple of times in our conversation, which I think that visitor, whom I mentioned that you were from Brazil, referred to, which is a certain, well, you said poetic quality, or poetic or maybe even something romantic Would you agree with that? Is that an interest, and how would you describe it? How does it express itself as sort of poetic character in the work?
Well, I say poetic because it's not like a specific narrative. It asks more. It asks people to engage with it and, take it away. So I don't think a lot of people see romanticism on my pieces. I'm not quite sure about that. I think there's a little perversity running under it that it's not very romantic. I mean, some of the elements might look romantic, but I think they're, how do I say this? There's a little bit of doubt there about this whole idea. It uses the imagery, but it has other things underlining it. I think my work has more to do with the Baroque subjectivity than the romantic subjectivity. It's more like opposites struggling against each other, ideas.
It's interesting that you mentioned fragility, because I think that's also very much at the heart of this particular installation, and this notion that we sort of have to redo it, or we're thinking about like how can we make the piece install it in a different way.
Yeah.
Never really thought about fragility until you really mentioned it, and now it's like there's a certain tenderness to it, which I think maybe has something to do with a romantic character.
Also, my work, I think it asks a lot from collectors, because it's almost like you have to care enough to have it, It's not something easy. Sometimes you have to redo it several times. So it asks an engagement that it's sort of like a love story in itself, It asks you to go a little bit further than the usual relationship that you would have with a painting. So, which I find good,
Well, romance and love is also, again, another sort of big theme in your work. And I think the first piece that I ever saw of you was a series of books where they were all, I think, with the title that had the word love in the title. There was an alteration taking place where you erased all the sentences that didn't refer to love.
No. It's I republished books that had love in the title in 5 different languages, but they're not necessarily fiction books. They were, philosophical books, political books, of every sort of way. But the way I did it is like I printed them again, but I took all the text out. I just left the title and the number of pages. And now the pages are, the books have the same number of pages of their original, of that version, because then you have the same book that was printed in different places.
And you repeated the size as well, because they're all different sizes, no? Or were they all the same size?
I all got them in one size,
Same
because it's
size,
very difficult to publish unique books of every different size. So what I took from them, it's the same amount of pages. So they occupy the same sort of volume of the original one, but they don't have the content. They just have the title that, the combination of the title creates a meta text that refers to the ideas of love. But, it asks you to engage with them and go ahead and have your own ideas or imagine those stories as well.
What was the first work that you made that was like dealing with books and book titles and?
Which was the first using books themselves?
Yeah, like in that way where, like we talked about several pieces
there was
now.
no one piece. There was a group of works that came out at the same time. 4-2, which are the dedication pages, the love stories, they all came about at the same time. But there wasn't like one before the other. It's just like concurrent. These ideas, they started to, there was always the interest in books. And there was always, I was working with this idea of publishing as well in a sculpture form. I've been publishing fragments of A Love, a Discourse of Holland Barthes
Yeah.
in a way that we created like a software program that you count all the characters and in the text, and then they are cast as a three-dimensional letter in porcelain. And the text become a physical thing and also a sort of palimpsest. Is palimpsest? No, palindrome.
Palindrome, yeah.
Palindrome, because you can use that text to write another text, right? So then the book becomes a physical object. So I was working with this idea, and I had worked with Adriano Pedrosa before. We started collaborating on these bibliographies. The first one he did for me was this garden bibliography that I ended up using as a piece. So from this collaboration with him, I started doing my own sort of like bibliographies. So Love was one, and then I sort of did the same thing with Time. So it's also creating this kind of imaginary libraries, that you don't necessarily need to read the books, but you can imagine them, because
They're often very popular books, though. No, I mean, I noticed that when I saw that show, for example, at Rivington, that most of the titles were familiar to me, at least. Sometimes I hadn't read the book, but the title, and I kind of enjoyed that sort of moment of like knowledge, sort of like, okay, I get it. I mean, it sort of revealed itself rather quickly, which I liked.
Well, to me, some of them are very well known, and it has to do with my desire that it's impossible to realize to read everything, which I'm never going to be able to. So a lot of those books are books that I admire, but a lot of them were chosen as well because they were interesting. Like One Night Stand. I don't know, is that a famous book?
One Night Stand?
Yeah. I don't think so.
Nobody seems to know that. Ironically, we actually had this occasion of this talk planned to launch a book, which hasn't arrived yet. This was sort of the plan for our talk, to present your book. And the book
our
isn't here.
ongoing book, yes. Which is also exists in time.
Yes, which sort of been lost in time. But it will, yeah. Alex, what's happening with the book?
Don't ask him right now. Let's not go there. It's coming.
So I just wanted to make sure that you all know that the book is coming.
And then we're gonna have
So look out for the book. Look out for the book. It's forthcoming. It's a beautiful publication, and in the last
Jens wrote an amazing text for it. So yes, but that's it gives us another chance to talk.
Yes, exactly. So we will be back next year here on the same stage launching the book. I think, yeah.
Right?
Anything else you want to add to the conversation? Any questions?
Any questions?
Hi, just a quick question. How challenging was this for you doing a public art piece for a museum? Was it challenging with just the public, or because the other piece you did that was the light piece where you just was an installation people walk through?
It's always challenging, not only at the museum, but anywhere. But in the museum, of course, it's more complicated because you have museums these days have much more concern about security and liability and all of those things, than really. So it's challenging, but I think part of it too, it's like you need to test the institution limits, and that's what we've been doing, sort of like it's a push and pull game that we try to get it something like we tried to have it down, and then we had to put it up, and now I want to install it another way. So you always sort of like testing, because even inside of the institution, nobody's in agreement. I mean, if the curatorial side of it, once it's done, the security has another issue. So you have to play with all these sides of it. I don't think just turning your back on it and walking away is a solution. I think it's more interesting to stay there and you know, and develop different strategies. You know, like ours for this, it's the idea that the work exists in time, and it's an experimental, you know, and I can keep changing it. We can keep like doing things with it and thinking about it together.
So yeah, the lobby situation is challenging because you have a lot of traffic there, people coming in and out, and you see the desk where the people are selling the tickets. So that area is particularly challenging. And we've done various projects there with a big sculpture in the center of the room. We had works just covering the walls. We had other pieces hanging from the ceiling with Clairefontaine. So it's also the desire of the museum to use that space again and again, but in different ways with different types of work. And I think this was probably the most challenging, just simply because people had to walk through that space and got entangled sometimes in these. There was one particular case where a woman almost strangled herself.
Doubt it. You know, I can't see it happening, but anyways. But you know, but that's part of, I think that's
There's a picture on
interesting.
Instagram.
Of the woman hanging on my watches?
Almost.
Come on.
But she had very big hair, so it sort of like pulled her wig off.
I would love to see it, but that's fun, see? Things
So it
to
became
get
a
excited
performance work.
about.
Any other questions, comments?
Valeska,
Yes?
you mentioned that you drew inspiration from books and music when you were younger. And then you mentioned that you're working with software now, or you have. So how do you approach technology, software, the fact that we're so close to having virtual reality around us all the time? Is that impacting your work at all?
Well, I think I use technology as I use any other tool. You know, it makes sense in the piece, and I don't like technology as a manneristic way of doing things. Like, say, when Photoshop was first used, just using filters and that I'm not interested in. But, you know, as long as technology helps me do things and then it's not about it, you know, it just happens to be there. I've been using it in several different pieces. I mean, I use DJ software and motors, but when you look, they're not there. It's almost like using technology to go back to this kind of like magic tricks the theater had before, this illusion that the technology is not there. You know, it's not the main thing. It's another tool. I have no problem with technology, as long as, you know, I'm kind of nerd, actually.
Do we have any other questions, comments? There's one more question.
Hi, Valeska.
Hey.
It's a question for you, but should be to any artist, contemporary artist. You work with different kind of medias. You have several influences and several kind of material you work with. Specifically, you are focused in books, music, time, this kind of objects. But if you have to resume your work, if you have to make a link between the beginning and now, what should it be?
That the work is about ideas and it's developing its own intelligence. I don't work with any specific material. Material for me is just a form to achieve a goal. You know, if I can communicate an idea through film, it's going to be a film. If it's going to be marble, it's going to be marble. So, and also material has meaning. You know, you can, if you change the material in a piece, it becomes something else. So, I mean, I don't have a specific material. I might have interest at times of working with some materials, but then, you know, they go away. I had a phase that was, mirrors were really interesting for me because they brought about a lot of things that I was thinking. But once I say everything I need to say with that, or with an idea, just move ahead and go someplace else. It doesn't mean that I'm going to be doing things with books. You know, like the Jewish Museum already brought some new ideas that I'm working on, which is like this idea of grounding, and I'm working with rugs. I have to show you, really.
I can't wait.
Okay.
Okay. If,
All right,
is
let's
anything
go
else?
have
Thank
a-
you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks to Art Basel.